Karen Lovejoy came up to me and asked me if I would do a little bit of volunteer work for her. And she was the head of a summer youth program for elementary school students at the school, and they were doing a whole session on the circus. And she asked me if she knew I did balloon animals, and she asked me if I would come and bring some of the balloon animals to make for the children, just as a fun activity during the circus period. And I said, sure, I'll be happy to do that. And it was like a week and a half, 2 weeks in advance that she asked me, and I hadn't really thought about it much at all until the night before I was ready to go over there. I was lying in bed, and I thought, I got all my balloons ready and everything, and I thought, well, I can't just walk in there and make balloons. I need some sort of an introduction or story or something to go along with it. And I was lying in bed trying to think what I could do, and then it occurred to me. I decided I would tell them the story of the wreck of the Black Squall that wrecked on Ocracoke in April of 1861. And it was really an interesting story. The Black Squall was traveling from Havana, Cuba to New York City. It was a two-masted, square-rigged brig. When in April it ran into a heavy gale that drove it into the breakers at Ocracoke. And it broke apart, and all the cargo spilled out of the ship. The interesting part of the story is that the Black Squall was carrying a circus from Havana to New York City. And when the ship broke apart, all of the circus paraphernalia washed out of the ship and wound it up on the shore. There were the big rings that the wooden parts that they used to make the circus rings, and juggling pins, and trunks of colorful costumes and trapeze paraphernalia and juggling pins, and the tents washed ashore, and the poles for the tents and everything. But the most interesting thing that washed ashore were the circus animals, and there were lions and tigers, bears, hippopotamuses, and camels and giraffes, and all these exotic animals that washed ashore on Ocracoke. And I was telling all this story to the children about all these animals, and they were just fascinated with the idea that all these wild animals were wandering around Ocracoke 150 years ago. And then I made the circus animal balloons for them and handed them out to all the children. And while I was doing that, I leaned over to Karen, and I whispered to her, I said, I heard this story. It was originally written down by Walter Howard. He died in the 1960s, and he had heard it from Arcade Williams, who was a teenager in 1861. But Walter had a reputation for being a really good storyteller. And I got thinking, I don't know if this story is really true or not, but I just whispered that to Karen. I didn't want to tell the children this, but at one point I'd read that the Black Squall had been carrying a load of sugar. And I said, I'm not going to ruin the story for him, but I'm really not sure whether that happened or not. So I finished making the balloon animals for the children, and I distributed them, and it was time for me to go home. And I was riding my bicycle home, and I thought, there's got to be some internet story about this wreck. So I went back to the computer, and I did a little internet search, and in about, 4 or 5 minutes, I discovered that there was, in fact, a ship called the Black Squall, a brig, that was traveling from Havana, Cuba to New York City. And on April 8th of 1861, it ran into a gale and pushed it ashore, and it wrecked. On the website, it said in the vicinity of Cape Hatteras. So I thought, well, that part of the story is true, at least anyway. But the interesting thing about it was that the website was really about a man named William Nixon, and it was about how he had died on that ship. And what was interesting about it was that this was not a website about shipwrecks. It wasn't a website about the Outer Banks or Ocracoke. It was just a website that referred to this William Nixon. And the reason it did that is that William Nixon was the nephew of James Nixon, who was the owner of Nixon's Royal Circus. And the Black Squall was, in fact, carrying Nixon's Royal Circus from Havana, Cuba to New York City when it wrecked. And I thought, this is wonderful. It really did happen. It was a circus ship wrecked on Ocracoke, and all those wild animals were running around on the island. And then I thought for a minute, and I said, well, lions and tigers and animals like that are circus animals, but hippopotamuses, I've never seen a hippopotamus. I don't think they're very easy to train. Or camels and giraffes, I don't see them in circuses. I thought, well, maybe he took some poetic license and he added those animals just to make it a more colorful story. But I did a little bit more research and discovered that Nixon's Royal Circus was almost always described as Nixon's Royal Circus and Menagerie of Living Animals. And then I did a little bit more research and realized that it was right on the cusp of the establishment of municipal zoos in the United States. And prior to the first zoo, which I think was in Philadelphia right about that same time, zoos were basically just menageries that traveled along with circuses. And when it was all done, I realized that the story was pretty much all accurate. The Black Squall wrecked on Ocracoke April 8th, 1861. The circus and all of its paraphernalia and the circus animals all washed ashore on Ocracoke, which was a great, great story. And what I learned from it was, everything else being equal, I decided to always trust my local sources about stories like that. And that's the story of the Black Squall.